So parts work, you've probably heard this term before. It's a buzzword that's been going around. Lots of therapists are using this. And internal family systems was really the root of the discovery of parts work. So we're going to dive in today to what is parts work, what are our different parts, and how can we find coherence and wholeness within the system that is inherent to us. We all have access to what we call self with a capital S and IFS. And coming back to self is how we really heal the parts of us who are feeling untethered and out in the ethers of our own psyche and feeling really lost and displaced. So in order to bring them back into a space of comfort and safety and security, we want to help guide them back to self. They've discovered that the self it's there in everybody, just below the surface of our parts. If we can get the parts to quiet and silence for just a moment, the self spontaneously emerges, as Dr. Schwartz says. And this is in everybody. And they've done different studies with all sorts of populations, from murderers and pedophiles to mothers and sisters and different types of people that with all walks of life. They've discovered self is just below the surface of everyone's parts. So what are our parts? There are 3 types of parts that we categorize through the internal family system. There's actually more if you want to count neo-exiles as well, but for the basics understanding, there are 3 parts that we really tend to focus on, 2 categories of parts. The first category is called the exiles, and the second category are the protectors. So first I want to start with exiles. Exiles are the parts of us who are what I like to think of as the root wound. They're ones that really went through the trauma, be it big T or little t trauma. They experienced something in their life, their day-to-day experience, that triggered the nervous system to respond in an unfavorable way. And so they learned how to navigate the world in a way to relax the nervous system because life was continuing to throw various challenges at them. And they hold the burdens, the shame, and the pain of these traumatic experiences. And so what I mean by big T and little t, this is something that Dr. Gabor Mate uses a lot, is understanding that there is big T trauma that people go through, being abuse, neglect, abandonment, all sorts of very serious moments in people's lives that cause a really deep, profound ripple of trauma. And then there's little t trauma, which is trauma of everyday life, as Mark Epstein calls it. There's these moments in our day-to-day life as we grow up that bring discomfort, and because we're not capacitated at a young age to hold those discomforts, we feel them as traumatic in the system. So just as an example, if you're 3 years old, your capacity is that of a 3-year-old, yeah? And so if your capacity is really young and doesn't understand, it's just beginning to learn what the concept of no is. The 3s being so challenging for parenting, specifically because they've learned at this time that they can get their yeses met, but they don't yet fully understand why they can't have them met at certain times. So these no's feel deeply traumatic to a 3-year-old. When a 3-year-old wants, dessert before dinner, they can't understand why their caregiver wouldn't give that to them. And so it feels very traumatic in the system of like, wait a second, this is something I need, I'm asking you for. And the caregiver, for many reasons, would say no. But the 3-year-old can't understand why it's being met with a no, so it feels overwhelming the system. Yeah, this is why a lot of 2 and 3-year-olds throw a lot of tantrums, because they're not able to yet fully understand or express themselves around what their needs are, why they're not being met, and how it's disrupting their emotional regulation within their nervous system at that young of an age, because they're still figuring out what it all means. And so there's different times throughout our neurological development in which we have certain moments where little t traumas feel like big T traumas in the nervous system. And just to give another quick example is around the age of 7, when 6, 7, 8, when we really have the part of the brain come online that differentiates us from the outer world. And so a lot of the clients I work with have these inner parts who are about 6 years old who were beginning to understand the difference between self and other. Like, not everyone has my best interest in mind. I'm entering into school and people aren't really that nice, and maybe my teacher doesn't really make me feel safe, and they begin to understand that there's an outer world out there that might not always have their best interest in mind, and that really sends the nervous system into a lack of safety and therefore constant moments of overwhelm. And so we have these different moments throughout our childhood that seem like simple moments we all must go through, which it is that simple. We all must go through these things and these moments of loss of innocence and learning and understanding. However, to the nervous system, to a child, sometimes it can feel so overwhelming. And these are often where our exiles are rooted. So if you go in and ask your exiles how old they think you are, very often they believe that you are a single-digit number. If not, they're communicating somatically. They're not even verbal yet. So to understand that most of our exiles are this really, really young, vulnerable parts of us that experience trauma, big T or little t, that live ingrained in the nervous system. So the exiles experience things over and over again to the point where they developed our second part, which we call the protectors. And so the exiles are called exiles because we actually kind of exile them away. We lock them in the basement or the attic, so to speak. We push them away because they hold the memories that trigger the nervous system, the pain of the overwhelm. And to feel the constant overdrive and overwhelm of being in fight or flight mode through our traumatic experiences at a young age, the body begins to learn pretty quickly of what's of service and what's of not. And so it begins to develop what we would call the second category, protectors. And these protectors, their entire job is to keep the exile locked in the basement. They're very well aware of what the exile went through, and they feel their duty is to protect that exile from further experiences that will trigger the nervous system from what it experienced. Their whole job is to make sure the exile never felt what it felt in the past ever again. And it's a benevolent intention. And so one of the beautiful things about the IFS model is that there are no bad parts. All of our parts are welcome in this understanding that they all hold benevolent intention, even if some of them are more unfavorable or self-sabotaging. They're not necessarily trying to harm the system. They just really have learned this way of keeping us safe, so much so that it's all they know and it's what they really believe. And again, these protectors, if you ask them how old they are, they're quite young. And so protectors come into two categories. There's two types of protectors the system often tries to develop. The first category we call managers, and the managers are our day-to-day staff. They are preventative staff, so to speak. They show up to mitigate anything in the outer world and control the outer world as much as possible to limit the unknown, because the unknown is often what will trigger these parts. And they do their best to prevent the outer world from really triggering the exile's root wound. And the manager roles often can look like inner critic or planner part or controlling OCD part. We have many managers that a lot of us can probably resonate with. And when the managers can't do their job, or they've done their job as best as possible and life still does life, yeah, we can only control so much in this really unpredictable world, we send in the second layer, the second tier of protectors, which we call firefighters. And in IFS, we understand the firefighters to be the parts of us who are maybe more self-sabotaging. They'll burn down the house to put out the fire. They do not care what happens to the inner world or the outer world. Their only job is to keep the exile locked in the basement. So when the managers do their job and it doesn't work because life does life, we'll send in a tier of firefighters. And most of us have created a system of how we send in these firefighters and when we call them in. And so I'll give an example that I give very often to when I'm introducing this to people, and this is the planner part. A lot of us can resonate with the planner part that helps us get to work on time and knows how to set the alarm. It plans everything out from our meals to our our bills, they make sure everything is kind of set and ordered and organized within our life, because it experienced at one point an overwhelm of being disorganized or not on time. And so it learned through the culture we live in to really regulate itself by planning as much ahead of time as is possible to mitigate the exile's overwhelm of the moments in its youth where it felt disorganized or shamed for being late or not doing something that fits within the box of the constructs of planning ahead of time. And so the example I often give is that you're about 8 years old, which is around when our planner part begins to come online. If you think about the modern American education system, this is when we begin to get scolded for not being in line, and we need to ask to use the bathroom and raise our hand and be quiet and be on time, and we start to get penalized for not being on time and criticized when we're doing things that as a child we're just doing because we're children. And they're beginning to teach us like, oh, like here's more structure. And so for a child, structure can feel really overwhelming in the system when they're really craving that freedom of being a child. So say you're around the age of 8 and you're in school and you hand a paper in late and your teacher shames you in front of the whole class. The whole class is listening and watching you hand this paper in late. And imagine as an 8-year-old, this teacher scolding you of, you turn this paper in late, I'm going to have to mark some grades off, make sure you don't turn it in late again. And your nervous system is responding to that as like, I'm in trouble, I did something wrong, there's something wrong with me. And now the whole class is being witness to this. So you're feeling all this shame and overwhelm in the nervous system. And maybe this has happened multiple times in your life. Our parts are often not one-off moments, but rather a series of moments that have triggered the nervous system to respond so often that we begin to create these various protectors. And so you're learning that it's not okay to be disorganized, and it's not okay to hand things in late. There's not a forgiveness policy anymore that there once was when you were younger. And so the nervous system is responding by this outer world and this overwhelming stimuli with stress. And it's triggering the fight or flight mode. And imagine the shame a little 8-year-old would feel feeling like the whole class just witnessed them get in trouble. And so you're holding that in your body. This is part of the exile's territory, as that it's ingrained. Those memories are there. And when you want to go back and revisit them, it will show you exactly what it went through and these deeply ingrained memories it holds. So that's the exile. The exile is holding the pain of that memory and various other ones, of course, that then create the protector. And the protector that's going to come in first is going to be the planner part. This is going to be the development of the planner part that's going to say, from here on out, we are going to ensure that we are never late again. We are going to double set alarms. We're going to make sure every paper is in on time. And it begins to mitigate the outer world as much as possible as a way to protect this inner exile who went through these very traumatic experiences as a child. And so the planner part, really important in our lives. And a lot of us can find a lot of gratitude for our planner part. However, like everything in internal family systems, understanding is that it's all in balance. And when our parts have too much power within the system and hijack us, when we don't have any awareness or consciousness that they are taking over, it can be unhelpful. Yeah. So like think of these parts like planner part, you are so helpful when I need to be on work on time. However, you're not always helpful when I'm trying to just relax on the beach or meditate or do something where I don't need to know what I'm planning for tomorrow morning. I don't need to know what I'm planning for lunch this afternoon. I'm good. Let me be present. And the planner part doesn't know presence. It's always thinking about the future. And so it's living in the anxieties and stress of planning the future constantly in order to prevent the eruption of the exile who lives in the past. And so when we're living in this back and forth of past and present, we're not able to really, or past and future, we're not really able to stay present. And so it's hard when we're living in the world of parts and they're constantly hijacking us to stay present, because the parts that often hijack us are, again, preventing the past from coming up by predicting and controlling the future. So fast forward 30 years and you're working in some big corporate job and your planner part has mitigated everything to the best of its ability. It has set your clothes out ahead of time, made sure the gas tank was full, backed up the project it's going to present to its big CEO today on a hard drive. It's mitigated the outer world so much as is possible because it knows this event today is a huge deal. And that inner exile is feeling the overwhelm of, oh gosh, what if we're late? What if we get disapproval? What if we feel the shame we did something wrong? So the planner part is doing its best to keep that, it's okay, pushing the exile back down. It's good. I got you. I'm going to plan all of this. I'm going to make sure we're safe and secure to enter this meeting and we're good. Yeah, so it's figuring that out and it's spending its time really putting a lot of energy into prevention. So then you've done everything that your planner part could do. You've mitigated, you've left a half hour early. You're ready for this huge deal meeting. And you get into your car and you enter out into the big world that is always unpredictable. And what are you met with? You're met with life. And sometimes life looks like traffic. So you get stuck in a traffic jam, an unexpected traffic jam, car accident, it's bumper to bumper. And so what do you do now? What do your nervous system do when the exile begins to surface of, oh no, what if we're late? What are we going to feel in the nervous system if we're late and we feel all of this shame begin to bubble up and these fears of that shame begin to bubble up? And the manager is like, oh, shoot, I've done everything I can. What do I do now? That's when we send in the second tier of protectors, which are our firefighters. And our firefighters are really, really good at coming in on a whim and a momentary notice to calm the nervous system. They have many different strategies in which to do this. And often one of the most common ones that you could probably relate to are things like anger, dissociation, addiction. So I'll give you an example using the same example. We're in the car, we're feeling now the system is feeling the exile bubble up. The firefighter's gonna come in and shove that exile back in the basement. And maybe the first thing is anger. Oh, I can't believe I'm stuck in traffic. And most of us can resonate being stuck in traffic when we had somewhere to be. And so what did that feel like in the body? It felt like you've lost control. Something out of your control has happened. Now I'm feeling deep stress. I'm angry at the person in front of me. I'm angry that this is happening. I'm feeling that. I'm replacing the sadness and shame with anger is a really quick tool that the firefighters know how to use to come in and bring the system into almost like a form of projection. Now I'm looking into my outer world as them being the problem, and I'm going to feel anger and push my anger and energy out towards that situation rather than understand that it's actually a deep-rooted phenomenon within my system around shame of being late, fear of being shamed of being late. And so anger, right, we can only sit in anger so much before we realize it's unhelpful. And so we've sent in our first tier of firefighters and it didn't work. It hasn't done anything other than overwhelm the nervous system a little more, just in a different way. So then we're going to send in our second tier of firefighters. We've accepted it's bumper to bumper. There's nothing we can do. We've let out all of our anger onto our steering wheel. And now we're just sitting in, well, what the heck do I do? So you begin to scroll the phone or send in dissociation. Yeah, we begin to scroll the phone, turn on the music, try to take our head out into the clouds so that we're not feeling the pain of the exile. We're trying to drop away from the fear that is beginning to rise. And so then maybe that's only working for so long. And then send in the third tier of firefighters, which is maybe addiction. Maybe we smoke the vape or the cigarette, or fill in the blank of the different addictions people use to numb the system when there's overwhelm. So that's an example of the different types of tiers that we'll send in on any given situation that we're trying to navigate when life does life, because life will always do life and we can only prevent it so much. And while our managers are really good at preventative measures, our firefighters are really often who step in and kind of hijack the system pretty quickly. And that's where we can get really self-sabotaging behavior or behavior that's really, really harmful to others. So those are the parts we really want to focus on and work on. And we kind of call it peeling back the onion within internal family systems. In order to get to that exile, we first have to go through our protectors, because our protectors are protecting the exile have been doing this job for 15, 20, 30, 40 years. It's all they know. And they really believe that they are self. They believe that they are in charge. And if they don't do their job, the whole system is going to fail. So they really hold this job very seriously. They hold it really tight, and they're protecting this exile with every ounce of energy that they have. And that protection is really, really important and beautiful thing to honor. And so part of internal family systems is also making sure we honor our protectors, make sure they have their needs met in order to get to the exile, the root wound, and really do the deep inner healing IFS offers. And so in order to get there, again, in this peeling back of the onion, we need to create relationship with our protectors. We need to allow them to feel safe and seen within the system before they'll allow us to go to the exile. And IFS understands that most modern therapies try to go immediately to the exile without getting permission from the protectors first. And this can be really dangerous, because if we open up space for the exile without having permission, the protector sometimes will come back in stronger and more hardened. Because say, for example, we open something up in the system that's a really deep wound, our deepest wound, in a 1-hour session with a therapist, and then we leave the session and now we're feeling all of that, but we don't have the tools and resources. We don't know how to go to self to hold that space throughout our week. Then what do we do? And it can be really actually dangerous for the inner system to bring all of that up without creating a safe place for them to go. And so then the protectors will come back in doing their job again and be like, I have to work even harder now, because now you've brought all of this up, but we were unprepared to hold all of this information and these memories. So I'm going to protect even harder. I'm going to dissociate you even harder. I'm going to pull you away even harder, whatever the protector's role is. And so it's really important, and IFS understands that we must go through the protectors, unravel them slowly and safely to get to the exile and the innermost wounding, in order to do really deep, profound healing that is sustainable and that also lasts lifelong. So that creating a relationship is a really important part of IFS, which is what comes back to self-energy. When we learn how to cultivate self-energy, which is the part of us who is not a part, it doesn't have preferences or agendas, it's the part that has lived many lives before probably, and will probably continue on to live many more. It's directly connected to whatever it is that this human experience is. It's what connects me to you, to the plants, to the ether and the cosmos, to all of it, whatever all of this is, we actually have access to it right inside of us, this inner divinity, this inner connection to creation. And so that creativity is something to really tap into and call on. It's our creative life force energy. It's what makes us feel alive. And the parts can often get in the way and hijack the self, so that we can't feel all that aliveness. Rather, we're staying in fight or flight or heavy planner modes, lots of controlling parts, or parts for like exiles of the past that are being triggered throughout our day-to-day experiences, and then the protectors that are working overtime to keep the exiles locked away. And when we're in this cycle of parts, and we can't access self, we can just feel constantly exhausted, constantly in the state of fight or flight. So in order to leave fight or flight and enter into a state of calm, access to our courage, our creativity, our curiosity, these are parts of the self. The self doesn't have these preferences or these traumas. It has just access to divine energy in order to really help us access wholeness, is what it really is helping us come back into wholeness and making space and room for all of our parts to be welcome, and helping free them from these deep burdens and pains that they're holding. And IFS really has a methodology that actually frees them and changes the narratives that they hold tight and unburdens them from these roles they think that they have to play in order to keep the system safe. And so with that being said, that's just the basic methodology of internal family systems. we'll drop more into the different parts, into how we can unburden, into the 8 C's of the self and how we can harness self energy. And there's so many different ways that we all try to come to self. And I offer a lot of different opportunities for us to access that. And I'm sure you have plenty of your own ways of finding self. But that's the goal of IFS, is really to come back to our inherent wholeness through accessing self and creating spaciousness between self and part, and relationship between self and part, so that the parts feel that there's internal caregiving, that they feel there's self-leadership, there's somebody inside that they can call on that they didn't have when they were a child to call on. Maybe their caregivers weren't present or available, or there wasn't access, but now there is. You're resourced now. So we try to update these inner children and these inner parts to who you are now and how resourced you are now, and continuing to build that resource and show them by continuing to build that relationship and hold them in those relationships by giving them access to self. So that's the basic goal of internal family systems. And there's lots of ways to get there. And if you're interested in continuing to explore all those different ways that you can get to self energy, learn more about your parts and how they help you walk through the world and go in and meet them, I highly recommend exploring internal family systems for yourself.